It was a quiet night in Los Angeles, the kind of night when the city felt almost peaceful. Keanu Reeves stepped out of a small cafe, holding a cup of black coffee and a script. The streetlights flickered faintly, casting long shadows over the empty sidewalk. The air was cool, and the hum of distant traffic filled the silence. As he sipped his coffee and walked toward his car, something caught his eye. Across the street, under the dim glow of a flickering lamp, stood a stray dog. Its fur was scruffy, a mix of black and gray, and one of its eyes glowed red. Not like the reflection of light in an animal's eye, this was something else, something unnatural. The red light pulsated faintly, almost like it was alive. Kenny stopped in his tracks, staring at the dog. It stared back, unblinking. There was something intelligent in the way it looked at him, almost as if it was sizing him up. He tilted his head slightly, intrigued. "You okay, buddy?" he called out softly, unsure why he was talking to a stray dog. The dog didn't move, but its red eyes seemed to flicker for a moment. Then, without warning, it turned and started walking away, its movements deliberate and smooth. Kenny frowned. Most stray dogs either approached people or ran off when noticed, but this one seemed to want him to follow. He hesitated, glancing around. The street was empty. There was no one to ask if they'd seen the dog before or if it belonged to someone. Against his better judgment, he found himself stepping off the curb, his curiosity getting the better of him. The dog turned a corner, and Kenny quickened his pace to keep up. When he reached the corner, he saw the dog standing at the mouth of an alleyway, its glowing red eye visible even in the shadows. As soon as it saw him, it took off again, moving deeper into the alley. "All right," Kenny muttered to himself, setting his coffee and script down on a nearby ledge. "Guess we're doing this." He followed the dog into the alley, his footsteps echoing off the walls. The air was damp and carried the faint smell of garbage. The dog weaved through the narrow passage with ease, occasionally glancing back to ensure Kenny was still following. "Where are you taking me?" he asked, half laughing at the absurdity of the situation. The dog, of course, didn't answer. The chase continued through the city's quieter parts, abandoned lots, overgrown yards, and graffiti-covered walls. Kenny was starting to wonder if this was a wild goose chase when the dog suddenly stopped at the edge of a vacant lot. It stood still, its head tilted slightly, as if listening to something. Kenny caught up, panting lightly. "This better be good," he said, placing his hands on his hips. The dog looked at him, and for the first time, Kenny noticed something strange. The red eye wasn't just glowing, it was scanning. A faint red beam extended from the eye, moving over the area in front of them. Kenny froze, unsure of what he was witnessing. Before he could process it, the dog barked sharply and bolted toward an old, run-down warehouse at the far end of the lot. "Wait," Kenny called out, breaking into a jog to follow. The warehouse loomed ahead, its metal doors rusted and its windows cracked. It looked abandoned, but the dog darted toward it like it had a purpose. The dog reached the door and scratched at it, then turned to look at Kenny. Its red eye flickered again, almost impatiently. "All right, I get it," Kenny said, stepping closer. "You want me to open it?" He grabbed the rusty handle and gave the tug. The door creaked loudly as it opened, revealing the dark interior of the warehouse. The dog slipped inside without hesitation, disappearing into the shadows. Kenny hesitated, peering into the darkness. His instincts told him to turn around and leave, but something about the dog, and that red eye, drew him in. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind him. The warehouse was cold and smelled of oil and dust. Broken machinery and scattered papers littered the floor. A faint buzzing sound echoed through the space, but Kenny couldn't tell where it was coming from. The dog stood a few feet ahead, its glowing eye casting an eerie light on the ground. "What is this place?" Kenny whispered to himself. The dog barked once, sharp and clear, then moved deeper into the warehouse. Kenny followed, his footsteps crunching on debris. As he rounded a corner, he spotted strange markings on the walls, symbols he didn't recognize. They looked like they had been painted hastily, some smeared as if someone had tried to wipe them away. His heart pounded as he followed the dog farther in. The buzzing sound grew louder, and the air felt heavier. He was about to ask the dog what it was leading him to, another absurd thought, when he heard a noise behind him, a faint shuffle like a footstep. Kenny spun around, his body tense. "Hello," he called out. The only response was silence. The dog growled low, its red eye flickering more intensely now. It stood protectively in front of Kenny, its posture rigid and alert. Something was here, and whatever it was, Kenny was certain his night had just taken a very unexpected turn. Kenny's heart pounded as he stood in the dimly lit warehouse, his eyes darting around. The faint shuffle he'd heard sent a chill down his spine. The dog remained motionless, its red eye glowing brighter, as if reacting to an unseen presence. "Okay, buddy, what's the plan here?" Kenny muttered under his breath, unsure if he was talking to himself or the dog. The dog growled again, a deep guttural sound that echoed in the quiet space. Suddenly, the shuffle turned into quick, deliberate footsteps. Kenny spun around just in time to see a shadow dart across the room, disappearing behind a pile of machinery. "Who's there?" Kenny called out, his voice steady but firm. There was no answer. The dog barked sharply, then bolted toward the shadows without hesitation. Kenny hesitated for a moment but quickly followed. His boots crunched against the debris-covered floor as he tried to keep up with the dog's swift movements. The dog led him through a maze of rusted equipment and scattered crates, its glowing red eye lighting the way. The faint buzz that had filled the air earlier grew louder with each step, like a warning signal. Kenny's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but his curiosity, and the dog, pushed him forward. They reached a section of the warehouse where the floor was littered with strange devices. Some looked like pieces of broken machinery, while others were completely alien, unlike anything Kenny had ever seen. Before he could examine them closely, the dog barked again, urging him to keep moving. "This better not be a trap," Kenny muttered, jogging to catch up. As they rounded another corner, Kenny saw him, a man standing in the shadows, his face partially illuminated by the glow of a small, humming device in his hand. He was tall, with a scar running down one side of his face, and his eyes were cold and calculating. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice low and menacing. Kenny stopped in his tracks, his fists instinctively clenching. The dog growled, positioning itself between Kenny and the stranger. Its red eye pulsed, casting a faint light on the man's face. "Look, I don't know what's going on," Kenny said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "But your friend here," he gestured to the dog, "dragged me into this. Maybe you can explain." The man smirked. "That's not your dog. You don't even know what it is, do you?" Kenny frowned. "It's a dog with a glowing red eye. That's enough to make anyone curious." The man took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's not just a dog. It's something far more dangerous, and you've seen too much." Before Kenny could respond, the man lunged at him, his hand reaching for the device in his pocket. Kenny reacted instinctively, dodging to the side and raising his hands in a defensive stance. The dog leaped into action, its agility startling. It jumped between them, knocking the device out of the man's hand with a swift swipe of its paw. The device hit the ground, emitting a sharp crackling noise before going dark. The man cursed under his breath, reaching for something else in his jacket, but the dog was faster. It lunged at him, forcing him to stumble backward. Kenny took advantage of the moment, grabbing a nearby metal pipe and stepping forward. "Back off," Kenny shouted, swinging the pipe in a warning gesture. The man froze, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the situation. The dog growled, its glowing red eye fixed on him like a laser. For a moment, no one moved. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," the man said finally, his tone filled with a mix of frustration and fear. "That thing isn't your ally. It's a weapon." Kenny glanced at the dog, which remained alert and protective. "Looks more like a hero to me," he said, his voice steady. The man scowled but didn't make another move. He slowly backed away, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. "This isn't over," he said, his eyes darting between Kenny and the dog. "You'll regret getting involved." Before Kenny could respond, the man turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows. Kenny started to follow, but the dog barked sharply, stopping him in his tracks. "All right, I get it," Kenny said, lowering the pipe. "Not worth chasing him." The dog trotted over to the fallen device, sniffing it cautiously. Its red eye flickered, and a faint light emitted from the device, casting a holographic image into the air. Kenny stepped closer, his eyes widening as he took in the sight, a map marked with symbols and coordinates, along with a series of strange codes. "What the?" Kenny muttered, leaning in for a closer look. The dog barked once, then looked up at him expectantly. It was clear the animal wanted him to see this, to understand it. Kenny stared at the map, trying to make sense of it. "This is bigger than I thought," he said quietly, his mind racing. "All right, buddy, let's see where this takes us." With the map's coordinates burned into his mind and the dog by his side, Kenny knew there was no turning back now. The cold air inside the warehouse felt heavier as Kenny stared at the faint hologram emitted by the device. The map flickered, showing coordinates leading to an unknown location, along with symbols that looked like a mix of mathematical formulas and strange runes. "What are you trying to show me?" Kenny asked, glancing down at the dog. The dog barked softly and tilted its head toward the deeper parts of the warehouse, where the buzzing sound grew louder. Kenny pocketed the device and followed the dog, his grip tightening around the pipe he still carried. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, the space seemed to change. The scattered debris and broken machinery gave way to more organized equipment, Computers, monitors, and even what looked like weapons. Everything was dusty, as though it hadn't been touched in years, but the faint hum of power suggested otherwise. Kenny felt a chill run down his spine. "This doesn't look abandoned to me," he muttered. The dog stopped abruptly, its red eye glowing brighter. It growled low, a sound that sent a wave of unease through Kenny. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on a small door at the far end. The dog moved toward it, sniffing the ground as it went. Kenny hesitated, glancing around. The warehouse was too quiet now, as if holding its breath. He followed the dog to the door and tried the handle. It was locked. "Figures," he muttered. He stepped back and raised the pipe, swinging it hard against the lock. The metal screeched and bent under the force, and after a few more swings, the door creaked open. Inside was a small room filled with monitors, all of them displaying static. A large console sat in the center, covered in buttons and levers. The dog walked over to the console and pressed its paw on one of the buttons. The screens flickered, and an image appeared, a live feed of what looked like a laboratory. Kenny leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he studied the feed. He saw cages lined up along the walls, each holding an animal with strange, glowing enhancements similar to the dog's red eye. Some of the animals looked scared, while others paced angrily, their eyes darting toward unseen figures. "Is this what they did to you?" Kenny asked, his voice soft. The dog barked, then turned toward him, its posture firm and determined. Kenny exhaled slowly, realizing what the dog wanted. "You want me to help you stop this, don't you?" The dog's red eye flashed briefly, almost like it was confirming his words. Kenny straightened, gripping the pipe tightly. "All right, let's do this." The buzzing sound suddenly grew louder, and Kenny spun around as footsteps echoed behind him. He wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps grew louder, steady and deliberate, as Kenny tightened his grip on the metal pipe. The dog growled low, its glowing red eye fixed on the darkened corridor ahead. Shadows danced across the walls as faint light filtered through cracks in the warehouse roof. "Stay sharp," Kenny muttered, unsure if he was talking to himself or the dog. A figure stepped into the faint light, and Kenny immediately recognized him. It was the same scar-faced man from earlier. He moved with a calm confidence, as though he wasn't at all surprised to find Kenny here. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" The man said, his voice low and gravelly. His eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Kenny. "I warned you to leave." Kenny squared his shoulders, the pipe held at the ready. "Yeah, well, your warning didn't stick. Care to explain why a dog with a glowing red eye led me to this circus?" The man smirked, pulling a small device from his pocket. "You really think you're in control here? That thing," he gestured to the dog, "isn't your ally. It's a failed experiment, a weapon we couldn't fully control, and now you've made it your problem." The dog snarled, stepping forward to stand protectively in front of Kenny. Its red eye pulsed faintly, as though reacting to the man's words. "Failed experiment or not, it doesn't seem too fond of you," Kenny shot back, maybe because it knows who the real problem is. The man's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. "You don't understand what's at stake. That animal is dangerous, more dangerous than you can imagine, and if you think you're walking out of here alive, you're sorely mistaken." Before Kenny could respond, the man pressed a button on the device in his hand. The room was immediately filled with a high-pitched whine, sharp enough to make Kenny wince. The dog yelped in pain, its glowing eye flickering erratically. "What the hell are you doing?" Kenny shouted, stepping forward instinctively. The man ignored him, his focus on the dog. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice cold and commanding. "You were programmed to obey." The dog staggered slightly, its growl turning into a pained whine. Kenny's gut tightened as he watched the animal struggle against whatever signal the device was emitting. Without thinking, he lunged forward, swinging the pipe with all his strength. The device shattered in the man's hand, sending sparks flying. He cursed loudly, stumbling backward. The high-pitched whine cut off abruptly, and the dog shook its head, its red eye glowing brighter than before. "You shouldn't have done that," the man growled, reaching into his jacket for something else. The dog moved faster than Kenny could react, lunging at the man and knocking him to the ground. It snarled viciously, its teeth bared, as the man tried to push it off. Kenny stepped forward, ready to intervene if necessary, but the dog backed off on its own, standing between Kenny and the downed man. Blood dripped from a shallow bite on the man's arm as he scrambled to his feet. "This isn't over," he spat, clutching his injured arm. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." He turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows before Kenny could stop him. For a moment, the warehouse was silent except for Kenny's heavy breathing and the dog's soft growls. Kenny crouched down, resting a hand on the dog's head. "You okay, buddy?" The dog's red eye flickered in response, and it nudged Kenny's hand gently. Kenny exhaled, his grip on the pipe loosening. "Guess we're in this together now." The dog barked softly, then turned its attention to the broken device on the ground. It pawed at the remnants, and to Kenny's surprise, another faint hologram flickered to life. This time, it showed a series of coordinates along with what looked like a countdown timer. Kenny frowned, leaning closer. A timer? What's that supposed to mean? The dog barked again, its eye glowing brighter as it stared at the hologram. Kenny didn't fully understand, but one thing was clear. Whatever was happening, they didn't have much time to figure it out. Kenny stared at the hologram, his mind racing. The countdown on the screen ticked away steadily, and he could feel the weight of urgency pressing down on him. Whatever this timer was counting down to, it wasn't good. The dog pawed at the hologram again, and the image shifted, revealing a detailed map of the surrounding area. A red dot blinked at the center of the map, marking their current location. Several other dots, green, blue, and orange, were scattered across the display, each labeled with cryptic symbols. "Is this some kind of tracking system?" Kenny muttered, glancing at the dog. The dog barked once, almost as if in confirmation. It stepped closer to the hologram, its red eye glowing brighter as it scanned the map. Kenny watched in amazement as the image shifted again, zooming in on one of the green dots. The dot was labeled Subject Number 7, and a small line of text appeared beneath it. Status: Contained. Location: Secure Lab. Kenny's stomach churned. Subjects? Are they talking about more? Like you? The dog didn't respond, but its body language spoke volumes. It stood tall, its posture tense and determined, as though ready to take on whatever challenge lay ahead. Kenny couldn't help but admire the animal's resolve. "All right," he said, standing up straight. "If that's where we need to go, let's not waste any time." The dog barked sharply and led the way, heading toward an exit at the far end of the warehouse. Kenny followed closely, his senses on high alert. The air outside was cold and crisp, and the faint glow of the city lights reflected off the damp pavement. The map on the hologram had shown the lab's location as being several miles away. Kenny wasn't sure how they were going to get there, but the dog seemed to have a plan. It moved with purpose, its glowing red eyes scanning their surroundings as they navigated the dark streets. As they approached a quiet intersection, the dog suddenly stopped, its ears perking up. Kenny froze, his grip tightening on the pipe he still carried. A low hum filled the air, faint at first but growing steadily louder. "What now?" Kenny whispered, his eyes scanning the area. The source of the sound came into view. A black van, sleek and unmarked, cruising slowly down the street. Kenny's gut told him it wasn't just a coincidence. The van's headlights swept over them, and the dog barked sharply, breaking into a sprint. "Great," Kenny muttered, running after it. The van screeched to a halt, and its doors flew open. Two men in tactical gear jumped out, armed with strange-looking weapons that glowed faintly. Kenny didn't have time to think. He followed the dog into a narrow alley, the sound of heavy boots chasing them. "Stop them," one of the men shouted, his voice echoing off the alley walls. Kenny and the dog reached the end of the alley, where a chain-link fence blocked their path. The dog didn't hesitate, leaping up and scrambling over the fence with ease. Kenny followed, his arms burning as he hauled himself over. The men reached the fence moments later, shouting orders into radios. Kenny hit the ground running, his adrenaline surging as he and the dog disappeared into the night. They didn't stop until they reached an old industrial yard, hidden from view by rows of rusted shipping containers. Kenny leaned against a wall, catching his breath. "All right," he said between gasps. "We got people chasing us, a map leading to who knows what, and a countdown that's probably not counting down to anything good. Care to explain how I ended up in this mess?" The dog barked softly, its red eye glowing faintly. Kenny sighed, shaking his head. "Figures. Guess we'll figure it out as we go." The dog nudged his leg gently, then turned toward the next street. Kenny followed, knowing there was no turning back now. The industrial yard was eerily quiet as Kenny and the dog made their way through the maze of rusted shipping containers. The glowing red eye of the dog cast faint light onto their path, enough to keep them moving without stumbling in the dark. Kenny's grip on the pipe tightened as the events of the last hour replayed in his mind. "All right, buddy," Kenny said, breaking the silence. "We're headed to a lab to do what exactly? Rescue others like you? Shut down whatever nightmare operation this is." The dog didn't respond verbally, of course, but it turned its head to look at him, its red eye flickering. Kenny exhaled, shaking his head. "I'll take that as a yes." They followed the map's directions to a nearby abandoned train depot. The tracks were lined with old rail cars, and faint lights glimmered in the distance where the lab was supposed to be. Kenny crouched behind one of the rail cars, scanning the area. The dog stood still beside him, its gaze fixed on the glowing lights ahead. Kenny noticed its tense posture and whispered, "What is it?" "You see something." The dog barked softly and stepped forward, leading Kenny toward a hidden pathway that ran parallel to the tracks. As they got closer, Kenny spotted a chain-link fence surrounding the lab. Security cameras dotted the perimeter and armed guards patrolled the area. "This place looks like Fort Knox," Kenny muttered. "You sure about this?" The dog growled softly, as if urging him to stay focused. Kenny sighed and followed as it guided him to a section of the fence hidden behind overgrown bushes. The dog's red eye scanned the area, and after a moment it turned to Kenny and nudged the fence with its nose. "All right, I get it," Kenny whispered. He grabbed the edge of the fence and pulled, finding a loose section that had been cut and poorly repaired. "You've done this before, haven't you?" The dog slipped through the gap, and Kenny followed, careful not to make any noise. They moved toward the lab's outer wall, crouching low to avoid being spotted. The faint hum of machinery filled the air, growing louder as they approached a side door. The dog paused and sniffed the ground, then barked softly. Its red eye flickered, scanning the door's keypad. Kenny watched in amazement as the dog pressed its paw against the keypad, and the lock clicked open. "That's a neat trick," Kenny said, shaking his head. "What else can you do?" The dog ignored him and pushed the door open with its nose. Kenny followed, stepping into a sterile hallway bathed in harsh fluorescent light. The air smelled of antiseptic, and the faint sound of machinery buzzed in the background. The hallway branched off into several corridors, each one labeled with cryptic codes. The dog led Kenny down one marked CivG-C2 holding, its movements quick and purposeful. As they reached the end of the corridor, Kenny froze. Through a glass window, he could see rows of cages, each one holding an animal. Some were dogs like his companion, their eyes glowing faintly in various colors. Others were larger animals, wolves, hawks, even a tiger, each with some form of unnatural enhancement. "Jesus," Kenny muttered, his stomach turning. "What the hell is this place?" The dog barked, snapping Kenny out of his thoughts. It pawed a control panel next to the window, its red eye glowing as it scanned the system. The lock on the door clicked open, and the dog pushed it ajar. Kenny followed it inside, his heart racing. The animals in the cages turned to look at them, their enhanced eyes glowing in the dim light. Some growled or hissed, while others cowered in the corners of their enclosures. "We're not leaving them here," Kenny said, his voice firm. The dog barked in agreement and moved to a large console at the center of the room. Kenny stepped closer, scanning the rows of buttons and levers. "All right, let's figure this out." Kenny's eyes scanned the control panel, his mind racing. Each button and lever was labeled with cryptic codes that gave no indication of their function. The dog stood beside him, its red eye flickering as it seemed to analyze the system. "Any chance you know how to work this thing?" Kenny asked, glancing down at the dog. The dog barked once and placed its paw on a glowing pad on the console. The screen lit up, displaying a complex grid of symbols and numbers. Kenny leaned in, trying to make sense of it. "This looks like a mix between a flight control panel and a puzzle game," he muttered. "Great." The dog pressed another button with its paw, and the cages around the room began to unlock with a series of mechanical clicks. The animals inside hesitated, their glowing eyes fixed on Kenny and the dog. "Easy, guys," Kenny said softly, holding up his hands. "We're here to help." Some of the animals stepped cautiously out of their cages, while others remained inside, their fear evident. Kenny noticed one of the larger animals, a tiger with a glowing blue eye, watching him intently. "Yeah, I'm talking to you," he said, taking a cautious step back. Before he could do anything else, an alarm blared, filling the room with a deafening wail. Red lights flashed overhead, and a mechanical voice echoed through the facility. "Security breach detected. All personnel, report to subject holding." "Of course," Kenny muttered. The dog barked urgently, grabbing Kenny's sleeve with its teeth and pulling him toward the exit. The freed animals began to panic, some growling and pacing while others bolted toward the door. "We can't leave them behind," Kenny shouted, but the dog barked again, its red eye flashing brightly. Kenny understood. Their chances of getting out alive were slim if they stayed. He followed the dog out of the room, the sound of approaching footsteps growing louder with each passing second. As they ran through the corridors, Kenny glanced over his shoulder and saw a group of guards chasing them, their weapons drawn. One of the guards raised a strange-looking rifle, and Kenny ducked just as a bolt of energy sizzled past his head. "Seriously?" he shouted, picking up his pace. The dog led him through a series of twisting hallways, its glowing red eye guiding the way. They burst through a set of double doors and found themselves in a large storage room filled with crates and equipment. Kenny slammed the doors shut behind them and jammed a nearby metal bar through the handles. "That'll buy us a little time," he said, catching his breath. The dog barked and began sniffing around the room, eventually finding a ventilation shaft near the floor. It pawed at the grate, then looked up at Kenny expectantly. "You want me to crawl through that?" Kenny asked, raising an eyebrow. The dog barked again, more insistently this time. Kenny sighed, crouching down to remove the grate. "I hope you know what you're doing," he muttered. They slipped into the vent, the sound of the guards breaking through the doors echoing behind them. The ventilation shaft was dark, narrow, and suffocatingly cramped. Kenny crawled through on his elbows, the sound of his breathing echoing in the confined space. The dog led the way, its glowing red eye lighting up the path ahead. It moved with ease, clearly accustomed to this kind of maneuvering. "You're really in your element here, huh?" Kenny muttered, his voice low to avoid drawing attention. The dog glanced back at him briefly, then continued forward. The faint hum of machinery grew louder as they reached the end of the vent. The dog stopped at a grate, sniffing the air cautiously before pawing at it. Kenny peered through the slats and saw a large laboratory below. The space was lined with rows of high-tech equipment, glowing monitors and glass chambers containing strange, glowing substances. Scientists in white coats moved about, some monitoring screens while others tinkered with devices. "This is the heart of it, isn't it?" Kenny whispered, his jaw tightening. The dog nudged the grate, loosening it enough for Kenny to push it open quietly. They slipped out, landing softly on the floor behind a row of tall cabinets. The dog sniffed the air again, its body tense and alert. Kenny crouched low, moving silently behind the dog as they navigated the lab. Every step felt like a gamble, the tension building with each scientist they passed unnoticed. They reached a console near the center of the lab, its screen displaying multiple surveillance feeds. The dog leaped up, placing its paw on the console. Its red eye glowed brightly as it began interacting with the system. Kenny watched in awe as the screens flickered and shifted, displaying encrypted files and maps of the facility. "What are you looking for?" Kenny asked, keeping an eye on the scientists. The dog didn't respond, its focus entirely on the screen. Moments later, the image shifted to reveal a blueprint of the lab. A large section was marked Primary Holding, along with a series of locked chambers. "That's where they're keeping the others," Kenny realized. Before they could act, the lab's main doors slid open with a hiss. Kenny ducked behind the console as armed guards entered, their boots clicking against the polished floor. The dog froze, its red eye diving to avoid detection. "Spread out and check every corner," one of the guards barked. "We've got intruders." Kenny's heart raced as he pressed himself against the console, gripping a nearby wrench he'd grabbed as a makeshift weapon. The guards fanned out, their rifles raised. One moved dangerously close to their hiding spot, his flashlight beam sweeping across the room. Kenny held his breath, his grip tightening on the wrench. Just as the guard rounded the corner, the dog sprang into action. It darted out, its movements quick and precise. Before the guard could react, the dog leaped at him, knocking him off balance and sending his weapon clattering to the floor. "Get down," Kenny shouted, lunging forward and striking the guard with the wrench. The man collapsed, unconscious. The commotion drew the attention of the other guards. Alarms blared and chaos erupted as Kenny and the dog fought to stay ahead of their pursuers. The dog used its agility and enhanced abilities to disable several guards, while Kenny relied on his quick reflexes and whatever weapons he could find. "Move," Kenny shouted as the dog led him toward a side exit. They burst through the door, leaving the lab in disarray behind them. The hallway beyond the lab was stark and cold, lined with reinforced doors. Kenny and the dog sprinted down the corridor, the alarms still blaring behind them. Red emergency lights pulsed overhead, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The dog stopped abruptly in front of a large steel door marked Primary Holding. It barked sharply, then began pawing at the control panel beside the door. Kenny stepped forward, scanning the panel. "This looks complicated," he muttered, trying to make sense of the controls. The dog's red eye flickered, and it pressed its paw against the panel. The screen lit up, and the lock clicked open. "Impressive," Kenny said as the door slid open with a heavy groan. Inside was a massive chamber lined with rows of cages. Each cage held an animal: dogs, wolves, hawks, and even larger creatures like tigers and bears. Their glowing eyes varied in color, a haunting reminder of the experiments they'd endured. Some of the animals growled or snarled, while others lay silently, their eyes watching Kenny and the dog with a mix of fear and hope. Kenny's stomach turned as he took in the scene. "This is worse than I imagined," he said quietly. The dog barked and moved to a nearby console, its red eye glowing as it accessed the system. Kenny watched as the cages began to unlock one by one. The animals hesitated at first, unsure if they were truly free, but the dog barked again, urging them to move. One by one, the animals stepped out of their cages. The larger ones paced cautiously, their glowing eyes fixed on the door. The smaller ones clustered together, their fear palpable. Kenny raised his hands, trying to appear non-threatening. "Easy, guys, we're on your side." Before they could make their escape, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. Kenny turned, his heart sinking as a group of guards appeared, their weapons drawn. "Freeze," one of the guards shouted. Kenny stepped in front of the animals, his jaw tightening. "You want to fight? You got one." The dog growled, its red eye glowing brighter than ever. With a sharp bark, it lunged at the guards, moving with incredible speed. The other animals followed suit, their instincts taking over as they fought back against their captors. The corridor erupted into chaos. Kenny dodged a guard's attack, grabbing a fallen baton and using it to defend himself. The animals worked together, their enhanced abilities giving them the upper hand. Within minutes, the guards were overwhelmed, retreating down the hallway. Kenny turned to the dog, who stood panting but uninjured. "We need to move," he said, gesturing to the animals. "This isn't over yet." The dog barked in agreement and led the way toward an emergency exit. The freed animals followed, their glowing eyes shining in the dim light as they made their way to freedom. As they emerged into the cool night air, Kenny felt a sense of relief, but also a deep resolve. They had escaped, but the fight wasn't over. There was still more to uncover, and he wasn't about to let these experiments continue. "Let's finish this," he said, looking at the dog. It barked in agreement, its red eye glowing brightly in the darkness. The cool night air was a stark contrast to the chaos they'd just escaped. Kenny and the dog emerged from the emergency exit, followed by the freed animals. The group moved quickly, weaving through the shadows of the industrial complex. The alarms blared behind them, echoing through the facility and growing louder as more guards flooded the area. Kenny glanced back at the animals, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like faint beacons. Some of the larger creatures, particularly the tiger and a massive wolf, moved ahead, instinctively guarding the group. The smaller animals stuck close, their fear evident in their cautious movements. "All right, everyone, keep moving," Kenny muttered under his breath, gripping the baton he'd taken from a guard. "We're not out of the woods yet." The dog trotted ahead, its red eye glowing brightly as it scanned the path. Kenny followed closely, his senses on high alert. The facility was sprawling, with countless buildings and corridors that could easily become a death trap if they weren't careful. The map the dog had shown earlier burned in his mind, but the reality of navigating it was far more challenging. As they rounded a corner, a spotlight swept over the group. A shout rang out, followed by the crack of energy rifles. The guards had found them. "Get down," Kenny shouted, ducking behind a stack of crates. The animals scattered, some diving for cover while others growled and charged toward the attackers. The tiger leaped onto a guard, disarming him with a single swipe of its massive paw. The wolf flanked another, its movements swift and precise. Kenny leaned out from behind the crates and hurled the baton, striking a guard in the chest. The man stumbled backward, giving Kenny enough time to rush forward and grab the fallen rifle. He fired a warning shot, the energy bolt striking a nearby light and plunging the area into semi-darkness. "Go," Kenny shouted, motioning for the group to keep moving. The dog barked sharply, leading the charge toward a nearby gate. The animals followed, their glowing eyes flickering like distant stars in the shadows. Kenny covered their retreat, firing at the guards who pursued them. Despite the odds, they managed to push forward, their combined strength and determination overwhelming the guards' defenses. When they reached the gate, Kenny noticed a keypad and a heavy lock securing the exit. The dog wasted no time, jumping up and pressing its paw against the panel. Its red eye flickered, and a lock clicked open. "You're a lifesaver," Kenny said, pushing the gate open and ushering the animals through. The group spilled out into a vast open yard, their escape almost within reach. But just as Kenny began to feel a glimmer of hope, a deafening roar filled the air. He turned to see a large, heavily armed vehicle barreling toward them, its mounted turret glowing with an ominous red light. "Of course," Kenny muttered, gripping the rifle tightly. The vehicle came to a screeching halt, and a squad of guards poured out, their weapons aimed at the group. The turret swiveled, locking onto Kenny and the dog. "Stand down," a voice boomed from a loudspeaker. "You're surrounded. There's nowhere to run." Kenny clenched his jaw, glancing at the animals. The tiger and wolf growled, their muscles tensed as they prepared to attack. The dog stood beside him, its red eye glowing fiercely. "You're wrong," Kenny muttered under his breath. "We've got everything to fight for." With a sharp bark from the dog, the animals launched into action. The tiger charged the vehicle, its powerful body slamming into the turret and knocking it off balance. The wolf led a group of smaller animals in an assault on the guards, their coordinated attack throwing the squad into disarray. Kenny fired at the vehicle, aiming for its tires and engine. Sparks flew as the bolt struck metal, and the vehicle lurched to a halt. The guards tried to regroup, but the animals were relentless, their enhanced abilities giving them the upper hand. The dog darted toward the vehicle, its red eyes scanning the turret. It barked once, then pressed its paw against the side of the machine. A high-pitched whine filled the air as the turret short-circuited, exploding in a burst of sparks. Kenny shielded his eyes from the blast, then looked around. The guards were retreating, their ranks broken by the combined strength of the animals and the dog's strategic attacks. "We did it," Kenny said, his voice barely audible over the sound of his pounding heart. The dog barked softly, nudging his leg. Kenny nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's get out of here." The group moved quickly through the open yard, heading toward the edge of the facility. The alarms had grown fainter, but Kenny knew they weren't out of danger yet. The guards would regroup and reinforcements could arrive at any moment. The dog led them to a narrow tunnel hidden behind a cluster of overgrown bushes. Kenny crouched down, peering inside. It was dark and cramped, but it appeared to lead away from the facility. "This the way out?" Kenny asked. The dog barked in confirmation. "All right, everyone," Kenny said, turning to the animals. "Through here, one at a time." The smaller animals entered first, followed by the larger ones. The tiger hesitated, its massive frame barely fitting into the tunnel, but it managed to squeeze through. Kenny and the dog waited until the rest of the group had entered before following. The tunnel was damp and smelled of earth, but it provided the cover they needed. Kenny could hear the distant sound of voices and boots as the guards searched for them. He pressed on, his muscles aching but his resolve unshaken. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged on the other side. The tunnel led to a dense forest, its towering trees providing a natural barrier against their pursuers. Kenny stepped out, inhaling the fresh air deeply. "We're safe, for now," he said, glancing at the dog. It barked softly, its red eye glowing faintly. The group moved deeper into the forest, finding a small clearing where they could rest. Kenny sat down on a fallen log, his body finally catching up with the exhaustion. The animals lay around him, their glowing eyes dimming as they relaxed. But their respite was short-lived. The distant sound of engines shattered the silence, and Kenny's heart sank. He stood up, scanning the forest. Through the trees, he could see the faint glow of headlights. "They're not giving up, are they?" he muttered. The dog growled, stepping forward. Its red eye pulsed brightly, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. The other animals rose to their feet, their instincts sharpening once more. Kenny gripped the rifle, his jaw tightening. "All right then. If they want to fight, we'll give them one." The headlights grew closer, the roar of engines cutting through the still night. Kenny and the dog stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next. This wasn't just about escape anymore. It was about making sure no one else suffered the same fate as these animals. The forest was about to become a battlefield, and Kenny knew there was no turning back. The roar of engines grew louder, echoing through the forest like a storm rolling in. Kenny stood at the edge of the clearing, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. Beside him, the dog's red eye glowed brightly, its posture tense and ready. The other animals formed a loose circle around the clearing, their glowing eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. "They're not stopping," Kenny muttered, his jaw tightening as he scanned the approaching lights. "This is it." The first vehicle broke through the tree line, its headlights cutting through the darkness. It was a heavily armored truck, its sides reinforced with metal plating and a mounted turret swiveling to lock onto the clearing. Behind it came more vehicles, smaller but no less threatening, each packed with armed guards. Kenny exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "All right, team," he said softly, glancing at the dog. "Let's show them what we're made of." The dog barked sharply, its red eye flashing in acknowledgement. The tiger let out a low growl, pacing near the edge of the clearing, while the wolf bared its teeth, its fur bristling. The first shot came from the mounted turret, a bright bolt of energy that streaked across the clearing and exploded against a tree. The animals scattered, moving with surprising coordination. The tiger charged toward the turret, leaping onto the truck and slamming its massive paws into the metal plating. Sparks flew as it tore through the turret's mount, disabling it in seconds. Kenny fired his rifle, aiming for the guards spilling out of the smaller vehicles. His shots were precise, forcing the guards to take cover behind their vehicles. The dog darted through the chaos, its red eye scanning the battlefield. It barked sharply, signaling the wolf and a group of smaller animals to flank the enemy. The guards tried to regroup, their shouts echoing through the forest, but the animals were relentless. The wolf led a coordinated assault, taking down 2 guards with swift, calculated attacks. The hawks swooped down from the trees, their enhanced talons ripping through the guards' weapons and scattering their ranks. Kenny moved through the battlefield, taking cover behind fallen logs and firing at the remaining guards. One of them rushed toward him, his rifle raised, but Kenny swung his weapon like a club, knocking the guard to the ground. Before the man could recover, the dog lunged at him, its teeth sinking into his arm and disarming him. "Good work, buddy," Kenny said, patting the dog's head before moving to the next target. Despite their efforts, more vehicles arrived, unloading additional reinforcements. Kenny's heart sank as he realized the fight was far from over. He turned to the dog, who was scanning the battlefield with its red eye. "What's the plan?" Kenny asked, ducking as another energy bolt streaked past him. The dog barked once and bolted toward one of the trucks, its glowing eye flashing brightly. Kenny followed, dodging enemy fire as he moved. The dog reached the truck and leaped onto its hood, its paw smashing through the windshield. Kenny climbed up beside it, prying open the truck's door and pulling the driver out. Inside, he spotted a glowing control panel that seemed to be linked to the other vehicles. "This must be how they're coordinating," Kenny muttered. The dog barked in agreement, its red eyes scanning the controls. Kenny grabbed the nearest lever and yanked it, causing the truck's systems to sputter and fail. The other vehicles faltered, their engines cutting out one by one. The guards hesitated, their confusion giving the animals an opening. The tiger roared, leading the final charge that drove the remaining guards into a full retreat. The vehicles that were still operational sped off, disappearing into the darkness. As the clearing fell silent, Kenny lowered his rifle, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The dog sat beside him, its red eye dimming slightly as it scanned the area. "We did it," Kenny said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We actually did it." The animals began to gather around them, their glowing eyes reflecting relief and gratitude. For the first time, the forest felt peaceful. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the forest. The aftermath of the battle was evident in the charred trees and scattered debris, but the air felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. Kenny sat on a fallen log, the dog resting at his feet. The other animals were scattered around the clearing, some resting while others kept watch. The tiger lay near the edge of the clearing, its blue eye flickering faintly as it kept an ear out for danger. Kenny leaned back, exhaling deeply. "Well, buddy," he said, glancing at the dog, "looks like we pulled it off." The dog barked softly, nudging his leg. Its red eye flickered, displaying a faint hologram of the map they had followed. Most of the dots had disappeared, but one remained, a red marker in the center of the display. "What's that?" Kenny asked, leaning closer. The dog barked again, its tone insistent. Kenny frowned, realizing the marker wasn't just another lab, it was something bigger. The hologram expanded, revealing a network of interconnected sites, all tied to the same organization that had created the lab they had just escaped. "So this wasn't the end," Kenny said, his voice heavy. "This was just the beginning." The dog stood, its posture resolute. Kenny could see the determination in its glowing red eye, a silent promise that their fight wasn't over. He nodded, rising to his feet. "All right, I'm in," he said. "But first, we need to make sure everyone here is safe." Over the next few hours, Kenny and the dog worked with the other animals to secure a temporary shelter deep in the forest. The tiger and wolf took on protective roles, patrolling the perimeter, while the smaller animals scouted for food and water. Despite their differences, the group moved like a well-oiled machine, their shared experiences forging an unbreakable bond. As the sun climbed higher, Kenny found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. He had stumbled into this adventure by chance, but it had changed him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. The dog, with its glowing red eye and unshakable resolve, had become more than just a companion. It was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was a way forward. Kenny looked down at the dog, who was watching him with its glowing eye. "Guess we're a team now, huh?" The dog barked, its tail wagging slightly. Kenny chuckled, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. "All right, Red," he said, giving the dog a name that felt right. "Let's see where this takes us." The forest was quiet as Kenny and Red prepared to set out, the map's hologram guiding their way. There were more battles to fight, more lives to save, and more truths to uncover. And this time, they wouldn't be running. They'd be ready. Together, they walked into the sunrise, ready to face whatever came next.